Hello, Pulp Hounds. So today I want to talk about Alan Hewitson, or to his fans, Archaic Al, which is a name I should adopt, really, isn't it? So the story of Al Hewitson's writing career is short and strange, but I really think he was a fresh and unusual voice in horror. And he was only writing for a few short years, but he's still remembered by his ardent fans to this day, and he's a bit of a cult figure. So let's have a little look at who this guy was and what he actually did. Al Hewitson's best known for working for a comic book company called Skywald in the early 70s. And he claims he wrote 500 stories for Skywald Comics, around 500. And I think he probably did. I don't think that's an over-exaggeration. And you'll see why. And let me just say, Pulp Hounds, if you're not big into comics and you're thinking, oh, what about comics? Just stick with it, because this gets really interesting. So Skywald, as a comic book publisher, started in 1970. Started by Sol Brodsky and Herschel Waldman. Waldman had worked in publishing colouring books and kind of that kind of thing. And then Sol Brodsky, if you don't know the name, he had quite a brilliant comics pedigree, working on a lot of Golden Age titles, working in the early days of Mad and Cracked and those kind of subversive humour comics of the 60s, which is quite important, that style. They started with 2 horror books. They did, during their life, they did publish other a few non-horror titles, but they're best remembered for their horror. And the first 2 were Nightmare and Psycho. And Skywald was like the first major challenge to Warren. Now, if you don't know Warren are the giants of this black and white horror magazine genre that was popular in the late 60s through into the 70s. And Warren managed to survive quite far into the 70s and into the early 80s. And why I think this is interesting. Okay, we need to go right back to the golden age of horror comics. So the gruesome halcyon days of golden age horror comics, they were brutal and unpleasant and shocking. And ultimately, there was a lot of media and government in the States, like, focus on these comics corrupting the youth. One book that's always referred to is Frederick Wortham's Seduction of the Innocent, which was quoted in all sorts of Senate hearings about these horrible books. And there are great YouTube videos out there about this era in comics. So ultimately, violence and real extreme horror in comic books was banned, and the Comics Code Authority was brought in. You can see it on a lot of like Marvel and DC. And basically that was an independent body that just checked that there was nothing that was going to corrupt kids' brains, minds, turn them into mad killers and things. So that was like the end. That was the death knell for this kind of violent golden age comic book horror. And Frederick Wortham is often cited as somebody that was largely responsible for that change in comic book censorship. But when James Warren came along, he'd already published the wonderful famous Monsters of Filmland magazine and a couple of other monster movie kind of adaptations into almost comic form, and then launched into publishing actual comics. Now, because these were large format, black and white, they were sold as a magazine, which meant James Warren could circumvent the Comics Code Authority, who were quite harsh on any kind of gore or like. If you're interested in horror comics, you obviously you'll be aware of what went on, but you can see like a shift, and you went from golden age brutality down to this like watered down, insipid spook stories that just didn't have that punch. So James Warren kind of kick-started this new movement of large format black and white horror magazines, even though they were just largely comics. And he got some of the best artists in the world. He got a lot of Spanish artists, people like Frank Frazetta. He got a lot of the old EC artists that were now struggling to find work, seen as like Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror were like shelved and done. They'd all finished. And he made this brilliant range of magazines that still endure and are collected to this day. And if you do something popular, you're going to get imitators. Although Skywald might have started out as an imitator, they ended up as something very, very different. So, enough about James Warren, because I'm sure at some point I am going to do a couple of videos about Warren titles. And let's look at Archaic Al Hewitson. So he was born in Glasgow in 1946. That's where the story starts, but it changes quite drastically in 1956 when his family emigrate to Canada. He studied photography at college and was very adept and continued to make money through photography for his entire career. But being in Canada let him indulge a bigger passion, and that was comics fandom. I mean, this is the early days of comics fandom, where people would write to an artist and the artist would send them sketches and handwritten letters and things back just because they were excited that somebody had recognised who they were and found who they were. Not all comic publishers, a lot of comic publishers didn't credit writers and artists back then. So it was kind of like a hidden world. And for a lot of the early producers of comic fanzines, older artists and writers were only too happy to do interviews and provide bits and bobs of art. It's quite an exciting time. It feels, not that I was there for it, obviously, but it feels quite a personal involvement, a lot more personal than turning up at a convention nowadays and paying for an autograph and you're just in a big queue, which is still brilliant when you meet your heroes though. So after a lengthy correspondence with Stan Lee, Al Hewitson was offered the job of Stan Lee's personal assistant. So he moved to New York and started working at the Marvel offices. He was responsible for answering letters on letters pages, or in fact, if a title hadn't got any letters from fans, writing letters for letters pages and then responding to them. He was also responsible for sending out comics, like big parcels of comics, to new artists and writers if they were going to start working on a Marvel book, so they could look back and work out what was canon and all that kind of stuff. So Al Hewitson figured that there wasn't a lot of room for photography in comic books. He'd done some and taken some photos of people like Stan Lee for Marvel books, but wanted to be more involved. He couldn't draw, so he started writing. And his stories did get picked up by Marvel, DC, Warren, and of course, early Skywald horror. So Skywald were doing okay at this point. Not quite as big as Warren, but managing to publish regular quality books. They had a similar approach as Warren, and got some really interesting artists that weren't necessarily best known for drawing superhero titles. As Warren did, they got a lot of European artists. And if you look back through these comic books, they are just a who's who of Spanish, Italian, amazing comic book artists that brought a new contemporary style for the early 70s. So in 1973, Sol Brodsky jumped ship back to Marvel. He knew Al Hewitson at Marvel and quite liked him, and suggested that he become the new editor of Skywald. They had one editor for all the titles. And this is where the fun really begins. Unchecked by another editor, unfettered by decisions on content, Al Hewitson just went for it. And he started this thing called the horror mood. He started his own title called Scream, but for him it was all about the horror mood. Now, it's quite difficult to quantify what the horror mood is, or was. In his own words, Al Hewitson describes it as this: imagine a transparent glass bowl into which you put every great horror story you've ever read. Every book, magazine, horror comic, horror movie. Add every scrap of information you ever learned about the human condition. Stir it constantly whilst adding a heavy dose of your own personality, which naturally includes your emotions, your intellect, your philosophy, your good and bad attitudes towards life and morality. Mix vigorously while adding every nightmare you've ever had. And then you can include a bit of fun. And you have the horror mood. So to kind of try and explain it in layman's terms that isn't Archaic Al's crazy poetic language, it's taking horror and trying to make it new. So, one thing Warren always did, and in the early days of Skywald, there'd be a twist, and that stems from the days of EC in their like Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, Haunt of Fear. A lot of their stories, the majority of their stories, were like a joke, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. What I mean is that their horror followed the structure of a joke. So you get the build-up, the setup, and then the punchline. And that's the structure of a joke, largely. Unless you're watching Vic Reeves. And a lot of the kind of 50s horror followed that format. You'd get your build-up, and your setup, and then you'd get almost like a horror punchline, which is the reveal, it's the shock. And a lot of EC stories were quite shocking and like, whoa, crikey. And that was a style of presenting horror comics that did continue with the early days of Warren and the early days of Skywald. But Al Hewitson's stories, they were strange. They were unpleasant and unusual. They didn't necessarily have that twist ending, which sometimes I find if I'm rereading EC comics, it is like a joke I've heard before. When someone starts telling a joke that you've already heard, it's just not as funny the second or third or fourth time round. And I think EC comics suffer from that. As soon as you start reading a comic, you're kind of like, oh yeah, this is the one where whatever happens. And Al Hewitson wanted it to just be a little horror experience. Just a little moment of unpleasantness. And it works. Sometimes when you finish reading a lot of the stories that Al Hewitson wrote, your reaction isn't, that was a brilliant twist, shock ending. You just kind of finish that story and you're a bit like, oh, is that's the end? And it just leaves you feeling, in a good way, confused and deflated, and it's not building up to that big shock. It's just setting a tone of strange unpleasantness, and then it just leaves your brain hanging as you finish the last panel. You're kind of like, wow, all right, what? Yeah. And that's something I think is absolutely genius in horror. And another thing that Al Hewitson did, and did with aplomb, was to turn up the horror to 11. Obviously, they could circumvent the censors. So a lot of the stories were, for like early to mid 70s standards, pretty flipping brutal. But there were titles like he ran, like the titles were almost what drew you in, because they were so ridiculous and over the top. Stories like, and it whispered and it wept and it did shudder and it did die. Or, I left my heart in the burial pit. I had no choice. Which is an odd retelling of Romeo and Juliet. This was a thing that Hewitson did. It wasn't... Yeah, there were stories of vampires and ghouls and werewolves. And there was a little bit of sci-fi in there, because that was very popular at the time. But there were these odd titled stories that featured romance, and I'm not being sexist, but I think a lot of these comics were largely read by males. And, you know, you'd have stories that would start with a ballerina, and it's almost like there was no conventions that he adhered to. He just wanted to tell a great and sinister story. But it wasn't just the stories, it was his entire attention to detail, and to just make you thoroughly excited about horror. He himself appeared in a lot of the stories, and appeared occasionally as like that kind of Crypt Keeper type horror host, which is very weird to have the actual editor kind of there. But his like attention to detail, this is from the back issues page. So you could always buy back issues from companies like this, and instead of just putting, hey, are you missing comics in your collection? Get these before they sell out, because they're going to be collector's items. Al Hewitson wrote, and it gets a tad harsh, are you a stupid, procrastinating cretin? Or are you intelligent and can anticipate the utterly grotesque alternative to ordering now? You know what'll happen if you don't order now? You'll begin to shudder a little. Then, slowly, you'll notice yourself becoming very nervous. After a while, you begin to hate daylight, then night dark. Then soon, you'll hate getting out of bed at all. Pretty soon, you'll be a totally bedridden and hopeless degenerate vegetable. Do you really want that to happen? Do you really want to become a totally bedridden and hopeless degenerate vegetable? Everything, every last aspect that he oversaw of production of these comic books, the horror was ramped up to 11. Archaic Al plundered some of the best comic book artists from Warren, largely. Jim Warren, who ran Warren, there will be a video about him, and his amazing publishing empire at some point in the distant future. Jim Warren was very defensive of his company and paranoid that his artists and writers would go and work for other comic book companies, and he famously got people to sign almost like contracts saying that they're going to work for Warren exclusively. And Jim Warren published in his magazines public accusations of plagiarism by Skywald. But Al Hewitson just kept sneaking all these artists who often worked under a pseudonym. They did Skywald because they wanted to draw for Skywald, because it was just like balls to the wall horror. There were no constraints, no, this isn't horror, we need a story about a vampire, we need a story about a werewolf. Just have whatever you want, do whatever you want. And visually, these books are amazing. Another thing that Al Hewitson did was start to introduce some of his favourite authors to his readership. Okay, so reading Skywald books wasn't a passive activity, it was an active activity. Al Hewitson wanted the readers involved in a way that no other editor has ever really managed to achieve. Hewitson was a fan of Lovecraft and started a series. There were a few series in Skywald Comics, which we'll talk about in a sec. Started a series about the Shoggoths and actually encouraged readers to cut out a little certificate and become a Shoggoth hunter and report in the letters page. I mean, they wouldn't have nowadays encouraging kids to go to lonely places looking for monsters. I think they'll find a very different kind of monster. But he also encouraged readers to send in their dreams, and the best ones would be illustrated. Turns out he never actually got any that were worth illustrating, so he wrote some that got illustrated as readers' dreams. He also put photographs of himself in, just out and about with his missus, having fun. And he involved the readers. Reading old issues of Skywald Comics, you feel like it's a little family. One thing Hewitson always did was to give artists and writers, when he was talking about them, a nickname prefix, which is something that I think Matt Groening adopted for the Treehouse of Horror Simpsons episodes, giving them a little single word nickname that sounds a bit spooky. So the series were a bit weird. Some of the series that they did a lot of just individual stories at Skywald, but they did series. One really odd one was a new adaptation of The Heap from Golden Age Airboy Comics, which Hewitson quite publicly didn't like that much. He didn't really know what to do with it. But some series just lasted for a couple of stories, like Love Witch, and some were long, sprawling epics. The problem was, and I haven't got a lot of criticisms of Skywald, but this is one of them. So, for example, Nightmare didn't necessarily have the same ongoing series. You'd get one part of it in Nightmare, and then the following month, you'd get another part of it in Psycho. And so, I get it was probably a marketing ploy to get you to buy all the titles, but I don't think readers were quite used to it. And it's a shame, because some of the series were absolutely brilliant. There's the kind of strangely self-reflective Who Are the Monsters type story of the human gargoyles. One of my favourites is called Nosferatu, which isn't about Nosferatu, oddly enough. Go on, Al, just mix things up. it's like a club, a group, and everyone wears a different animal mask kind of thing, and they meet in this lush castle. You can see where this is going, and each little issue, they tell their own story of misery and depravity, and I just think it's great. It's like an Amicus movie. It's the best unmade Amicus movie ever, and I think that's a really good way of looking at Skywald. If Warren were Hammer with their gorgeous Kensington gore and seemingly super high lavish budgets, Skywald are a bit like Amicus. They're a bit of an upstart. They do different stuff. They do unusual stuff. Whereas Hammer relied a lot on their use of the universal type monsters, Skywald just did whatever. Now, I'm not dissing Hammer. Anybody that knows me will know I adore Hammer as much as I adore Amicus. I adore Warren as much as I adore Skywald. So that's not a slight on any production company. One of the best was the Saga of the Victims, which was reissued as a complete graphic novel. And Skywald went under before this could be finished. So Al Hewitson got his original script out for the final episode. Now, the Saga of the Victims is a brilliant example of why Skywald are weird. So it's about two ladies that just go through different histories and dimensions, and they're victims in every dimension. And I think there's so much you can read into it about kind of the role of women in horror, especially for the mid-70s. It's quite groundbreaking that these women eventually seem to almost lose their identity because they are the constant victim in every situation. When Scream came out, that was Hewitson's baby. He wrote pretty much all of it, and I think it's the most horror moody title that Skywald published. It's just a joy to behold, a bizarre and unusual and sometimes baffling joy. In the first issue, Al Hewitson wrote a story called The Comics Macabre, where essentially two kind of comic critics, something akin to Dr. Frederick Wortham, turned up at the Skywald offices and told Al Hewitson, who was in the strip, that he had to stop doing horror comics. And they got so peeved with him, they ended up killing him with an axe. They get their comeuppance in a different way, which I'm not going to spoil for you if you ever want to track these down and have a little bit of a read. And Hewitson, being a horror auteur, but also so self-aware and absolutely hilarious at the same time, sent a copy of Scream issue 1 to Frederick Wortham, author of Seduction of the Innocent. And the bizarre thing is, this started a friendship between Hewitson and Wortham. And reading about this friendship, you can kind of see that Wortham's been painted in a bad light as just a dude that destroyed comic books. But I don't think that was the case. Reading about this friendship, he's very complimentary of Al Hewitson and seems to understand that Skywald was horror magazines for a more mature reader and could do anything in there. And Wortham really liked Hewitson's approach to horror. One thing Al Hewitson did was encourage his readership to go off and find other things. I mean, I've said that he was a fan of H.P. Lovecraft and tried to encourage readers to go and pick up Lovecraft books back when they were slightly more harder to find. The same with Poe. He encouraged his readers to explore Edgar Allan Poe. There's a lot that isn't necessarily supernatural in Poe, which I really, really love. And just encouraged horror readers to expand their mind. I mean, nowadays, a lot of people have heard of Poe. Apparently, back in the early to mid-70s, he wasn't reprinted quite as much as he is today. But all good things must come to an end. And in 1975, Skywald folded. Al Hewitson put it down to, essentially, down to Stan Lee. So this is all alleged. Please don't anybody sue me for this. So Hewitson, he's not the only person to say this. One thing that Marvel allegedly did was to threaten to pull their books from smaller newsstands and grocery stores that sold a few comics if they didn't stop stocking their competitors. Now, Marvel had just launched their own range of large format black and white horror comic magazines and didn't want any competition. Warren were popular enough to weather the storm, but a lot of smaller distributors stopped selling Skywald books, and ultimately that put them out of business, allegedly, according to Al Hewitson and other people with which I've read interviews that they've done, but it's all alleged. But apparently it's something that isn't just in horror comics, it's something that did happen, allegedly. So after Skywald closed its doors with a heavy heart, Al Hewitson carried on with horror and wrote a few film scripts for Canadian and American companies that were picked up. They were bought, but unfortunately never made. Al Hewitson wasn't too disappointed because he got paid whatever happened, whether it got made or not, he got paid. And then decided to go back to photography and publishing, and started some, I don't know what you describe them, local area specific magazines back in Canada. Just like, I guess it's a better equivalent of what we get pushed through the letterbox nowadays, that's just kind of full of adverts and photographs of the parish council kind of thing. And he did really well, and that kept him, it gave him a happy and comfortable life. Never really looking back at this weird and unusual and bizarre and thrilling and satisfying period that he wrote horror. It's a single page in a multi-volume set of the history of horror, but it's there. And these books were so cool. He still, to this day, has a huge cult following. Now, in January 2004, Al Hewitson passed away. But before he died, he managed to put together, like I said, the last episode of the Saga of the Victims. He co-wrote an amazing book on the horror mood and Skywald generally. So, at least before he died, he knew that those years he'd put into horror were respected and collected and admired. And I guess that's one little thing to be thankful for. He knew that there's a whole secret army of us out there that just devour those comics. So I ought to leave it there before it gets too long. Thank you for joining me, guys. And I'll see you lovely folks in the next video.